Welcome back to this week's episode of Containing Multitudes. My guest is Rabbi Ellen Bernstein. We're going to have a conversation we've called Identity as Spiritual Journey. That should be broad enough to take us anywhere that we want to go. Ellen has been wondering about religion and ecology since she was in high school. She founded Shomrei Adamah, Keepers of the Earth, the first national Jewish environmental organization in 1988, and is the author of numerous works on Bible and ecology. She recently published a new ecologically sensitive, and I can tell you, having used it this Pesach, beautifully illustrated Haggadah, The Promise of the Land, and she popularized the idea of the Earth Seder. This year, thousands of homebound Jews around the world participated remotely in Earth Seders. Ellen has also been thinking about identity and how the rise of identity politics, identity as relating to a particular group, has obscured an older, more profound concept of identity, identity as a dynamic outgrowth of our spiritual journeys. We will discuss identity in relation to her own spiritual journey and her work as a Jewish religious leader and ecological thinker. In the ads for this session and in the thank you that I post tomorrow, there will be links to her pages where you can learn more about her work. Ellen, welcome.
Thank you. It's really fun to be here. All right.
All right. So I would love it if you, when you and I met, we met at a little taqueria in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I invited you to tell me about your life, and it was quite an amazing story because it seemed that from a very early age, your life had been a process of not just exploring and thinking about, but actually acting on some pretty big ideas. And I'm wondering if you could tell us something about your journey now.
Sure, my pleasure. So I think as a very young person, even in my single digits, I was very much a child of nature. I hung out in the natural world all the time. I was constantly outdoors, basically. And some of this probably had to do with growing up in a family that was relatively dysfunctional and needing to be away from my family. So I think, that piece always figures in somewhere into the whole picture. So
do you mean that the natural world was a way of escaping your family dysfunction, or was it a way of connecting to a different kind of order than the dysfunctional order of the family, or something else?
That's a great question. I think it was mostly getting away from my family and feeling some sense of connection to something. Some sense of connection, some sense of parenting, even solace. I didn't have that in my family. I didn't feel like I belonged to anything. I think that may be a good way of framing it. I just want to say, this is I'm going to go back in time, but I want to just say that when I lived in Berkeley, California, that's where I went to college, and I always felt like Berkeley was my mother. I really related to that because I just never felt that sense of parenting when I was growing up.
It's funny because Jerusalem is referred to as a mother in the prophetic writings, but I've never heard Berkeley referred to that way.
Well, it was for me. Anyway, I was very, as I was coming of age and in high school, just at that time, environmental studies programs were starting to happen. And I ended up going to the first environmental studies program in the country, or one of them at UC Berkeley. Luckily, as even a step back from that, I actually had left home when I was 15 and went away to school just because it was so difficult being at home. And the school I went to offered courses in religion, and we were required to take religion classes. And there's also the possibility of taking environmental studies for your science class. And this was in like the late 1960s.
Wow.
So I took this environmental studies class, which totally, I just felt like this is it. This is what I want to be doing with my life. And we were required to take religion. So I was studying the Old Testament, the New Testament. Each semester we could take a different religion, but you had to take Old Testament and New Testament. Then you could take Chinese religion and Buddhism and all that kind of stuff. So I had no idea going into these classes in religion that what religion was. And I was Jewish, but really had very little, Jewish background. Judaism wasn't, my family was very assimilated. So when I started studying religion, I couldn't believe that that religions, and not just Jewish religion, but all religions, were speaking to the kinds of questions that I was having in my life, about meaning, about materialism, about the natural world. And so it was very exciting to me to find that religion offered something for me. So then I went to UC Berkeley and studied.
Could I just ask you
Sure.
something about that? So you said that when you did environmental studies, it sounds like you were saying you had a sense of recognition. You'd already had a connection to the environment and the natural world. And the way you described it, it was just like, oh, wow, environmental studies, this is rhyming with what's been going on inside me. But the religious studies was not something that you had been thinking about. And I'm wondering if, was it the way that religions were being taught that helped you recognize how religious thinking, and broadly speaking, was relevant to what you cared about? Or was it, as with environmental studies, was it just you had your package of big questions that you were living with, and you discovered that these religious traditions had their own versions of speaking to them?
I can remember when I was a young, like 10 years old, and someone in my family, one of my cousins, described me as the spiritual one in the family. So I think that I was always kind of oriented. I definitely had some sense of God in a very naturalistic, kind of transcendentalist way. So that was always there for me, but I never had any idea what religion was. And I think that experiencing it in the classroom was very unthreatening, and experiencing it textually. And all of this actually paves the way for where I ended up in my life. I feel like my early years, I'm actually coming back to that place right now, more and more. So I felt like, the fact that we studied religion in the classroom and everyone got to, respond and relate to the texts, that was really thrilling for me. So, shall I go on?
Please. I mean, you gave us the teaser. You said that early
Yeah.
experience led you to where you are, the kind of thing that you're working on right now. This is very
Yeah.
exciting.
So anyway, so then I was at UC Berkeley, and so I went through all of that. Actually, I should say, all right. So in my studies in environmental studies at UC Berkeley, anyone that takes an environmental studies class at like an intro class, you always do something that has to do with, there's always some section on religion and the environment, right? Like just as part of the eco-philosophy section, right? So what do you learn about Judaism or Christianity? You learn one thing. You learn Genesis 1:28, which for anyone who may not know what that, anyone in the like religion environmental world knows what that is. It's when God gives Adam dominion over the earth and all the creatures of the earth. So that's what I learned, that religion, that Western religion has to say about the environment. Basically, that we're given a mandate to control nature, and that as religious people, we're basically responsible for the environmental crisis. That's basically what I learned in college. Okay, does that make sense?
Unfortunately, yes, and it sounds like that philosophy is alive and well among some of the more politically connected evangelical Christian circles.
Right. But even more so, it's not just, it's that tons of environmentalists ended up then blaming the Bible for our environmental problems. And one of my very first speaking engagements, this is after I had started Shomer Adamah, but one of my first speaking engagements was people would come up to me and say, "You're Jewish? You know, like, what does that have anything, what could you possibly have to say about the environment?" So everyone would just reduce the whole tradition into this one verse, take it completely out of context. Anyway, so that was also there. So at the time, though, I didn't know anything about Judaism. So I just adopted that as well. I wasn't like this flaming, anti-religion person at all, but I just thought that was the truth because that's what I was being taught in college, So anyway, somewhere along the way, again, I was always really spiritually oriented. There was nothing to do when you graduated at that time from an environmental studies program. All you could do in your life was basically do environmental impact statements. That was like the only career path at that point. No one was really talking. Again, we're talking about the early 70s, the first birthday. People weren't really thinking very broadly about the environment. Anyway, I went on to get a master's degree in biology, and I ran wilderness river trips. And doing those wilderness river trips was a way to teach people about the natural world while being out on the river. So, and my feeling about those trips was that they were really very spiritually oriented trips, and that's really what I was doing. And I remember people joking with me, saying that they felt like I was the rabbi on the river. And actually on Sunday mornings, we would gather together and do readings from, great poets and nature writers as a way to help us appreciate the natural world.
Can I ask you a question about that? So this sounds wonderful. I'm so sorry I missed this, but you started out actually by saying that you very early on established your own sense of connection, really a family connection. You said that being in nature made you feel mothered and connected and part of something. When you were doing these river experiences, did you feel like you were trying to offer other people, help other people make the kind of connection you had? Did you feel like your own connection with nature was growing and deepening as you were doing these experiences also? Like, what was the relationship between that early core connection that you established and this work?
It was totally connected. I don't know how to get that phone to stop ringing, but sorry. So running river trips was the obvious kind of the obvious next step in my trajectory, because it kept me very close to nature, kind of embedded in the natural world. And I felt like this was a way that I could share what I had learned, basically. It was to share the spiritual experience of being in nature with people. And I can still remember really vividly the great blue herons that would always kind of play with us as we went down the river, and we'd watch them from going from one site to the next, and we'd follow them. And so for me, it was a rabbinic kind of experience. And actually, the reason I ended up leaving was because what the trips really felt like ultimately was just too much babysitting. People would come with alcohol. They weren't necessarily interested in what we had to teach. So ultimately, I left after a few years, and I ended up moving. So I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. I didn't have, I never had good counseling or around, like what's an appropriate job for me, or what's an appropriate path. And I felt like relatively kind of like, so I was a child of the 60s and kind of throwing everything out that had been given to me, living outdoors, relatively hippie-ish. And I ended up realizing, I need a career. I moved to Philadelphia to go to physical therapy school because I thought, okay, I can become a therapist and just do this very part-time and spend the rest of my life outdoors, that was the way I was looking at the world. So when I moved, but the whole point of this felt like a way to get to Philadelphia. So I moved to Philadelphia and ended up living in the renewal community in Mount Airy in Philadelphia, the renewal and reconstructionist world.
Can you explain just for some folks will know exactly what you mean, and other people probably don't know what those words or what kinds of communities you're referring to?
Okay. So in Philadelphia is the home of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And this particular neighborhood, Mount Airy, is a neighborhood in which many of the Reconstructionist students lived. And also Zalman Schachter, the Rabbi Zalman Schachter, lived in the same neighborhood. And he was the person who started what was originally called B'nai Or, which became Panei Or, which is sort of a very spiritual look at Judaism and Jewish renewal. So there were a lot of people like that in that neighborhood. It was extremely vibrant Jewish community. And when I moved there and started meeting people, I was asking them, is there any Jewish environmental organization? Because I had already been, I just started to get interested in Judaism, and I guess I left that step out.
Oops, we forgot Judaism.
Yeah, right. So actually, just a step backwards. So while I was in California, actually when I was still in Berkeley, I got invited to a Passover Seder. I had never, again, my Jewish life up until that time was pretty, non-existent. And I got invited to this Passover Seder. It was at somebody's house in the Berkeley Hills. And I walked in and there was a Buddha on the floor, and there were 100 people there, and it was overlooking the bay in Berkeley. And we were all sitting on the floor. It was a magical evening. And I met all these people who were really, really excited about being Jewish. And so this was actually a Jewish renewal community. This was the Aquarian Minyan in Berkeley. And I started studying one-on-one with Reuven Goldfarb, who at the time was the head of the Aquarian Minyan. So I started this whole Havruta study process actually with him. And I started looking at so we started with Genesis 1 and probably spent a half a year just on Genesis 1. We couldn't really get past Genesis 1. There was so much ecological material there that was so thrilling for me. So there was all that. So that was my Jewish beginnings. And okay, so then I moved to Philadelphia. I already had this connection to the renewal community, met renewal folks and Reconstructionists in Philadelphia. And that's where people told me that I should start a Jewish environmental organization because there really wasn't anything. And, that's what Reconstructionists do, right? You can't ask a question. You have to answer the question you're asking. So I started the first Jewish environmental organization. And for me, the work was so much about looking at the Bible and Jewish texts from like an eco-critical perspective. It was reading texts with asking ecological questions. And
can you give us I know you're going to show us, but can you just give us an example of what is an ecological question that you could bring to the Torah that gets us beyond human beings have dominion over the earth, let's drill?
Yeah. Just the whole question of what is the place of the earth in the text, right? And we could look right now, we'll look at some other materials, but one of the things that was really exciting for me was just reading Genesis 1 and seeing that the habitats were created first and that there was all this attention to habitat and that there was attention to the word zera, like it appears 6 times on the 3rd day of creation. So just seeing all of this stuff in Genesis 1 that was really rich. I mean, I ended up writing a book just on Genesis 1, which is called The Splendor of Creation, that really sees Genesis 1 as like a testament to sustainability. To me, that's really what that whole chapter is about. Anyway, that came much later.
I just want to say something because some folks have been here for many of the weeks, and a number of the weeks we've talked about centering groups or people's perspectives that tend to be marginalized in talking about the Torah or even marginalized in the Torah. And it sounds like you're saying, Ellen, that the work you've done has been to center that in a way the earth and the land have been marginalized in terms of the way the Torah has been read. And a lot of your work has been asking questions to bring the earth in and put it at the center of our experience of Torah. Am I getting that right?
Close, yes. To me, there's just always been this huge imbalance. And I felt like that what my work was about was to try to restore the balance. So as opposed to saying that to make the earth the center of our experience, it's more, the way I saw it more was that we have these two primary ideas of God in Judaism or in the Bible, Adonai and Elohim. And the Adonai idea is the God of history and the God of the Israelites, whereas Elohim is the God of creation and the God of the whole universe. And my feeling was that the idea of God as the God of creation and the universe was totally overlooked. But that this idea in the Bible is a primary idea, and that for lots of historical reasons, we've privileged this idea of the God of humanity, the God of the Israelites, over the God of creation. So for me, that's how I see the work as really theological, is bringing back also this idea of the God of creation as an idea. And yeah, I do think it's been totally marginalized. I feel like it continues to be marginalized because because people, I feel like so often Jews feel like that we have to talk about what makes us uniquely Jewish and how we're different from everyone else. And for me, I was just really interested in how we're similar to everyone else and similar to the creatures, and but that we have a different flavor and a different way of approaching things, you know, a different way of of looking at the world. But my orientation has always been extremely universal.
So the name of God that the Elohim name of God, the creator God, is the God that's connected with an idea of humanity as part of a larger universe, a larger creation. The Adonai, the personal name that Jews have for God, the God of human history, is more associated with particularity and the interests of a certain group. I'm wondering, and again, I'm probably getting this a bit wrong here, but I'm thinking about the formula for brachot and naming God in the brachot,
Yeah.
starting with Heinu melech haolam, our God, you know, ruler of the universe. That feels like that's the universalizing name of God. And then often we go into the more particular um, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. Is that right, that those are the two different kinds of ways of naming God that you're talking about? And if so, is the practice of brachot a way that tradition used to keep those more in balance, keep the other, the God as creator more in view?
Yes, I think that that exactly marries those two, and that we need to continue to marry those two ideas, but that we, like in modernity, we just don't do that. We've just privileged the historical and humanity above everything else. Yeah. So let's see. Just trying to think of where was I?
So you,
Oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, you remember, go ahead.
So I think one of the things you wanted me to talk about was some of the challenges around all of this in terms of my identity. And the way I always saw the work that I was doing was as reparative, as bringing back this ecological framework to Judaism, like and I saw it as part of our culture. I don't think I called it that in the earlier time, but I saw the work as a work of enriching the culture. That this was a lost, the ecological dimension of Judaism was a lost part of our cultural identity. And
And the part that connects us to everybody else as opposed to the part that particularizes, is that right?
yeah.
Go ahead.
And but so one of the challenges for me though was that so I founded the first Jewish environmental organization, and then other Jewish environmental organizations started rising up, and some of that other work felt much more political than where I was going, which was fine. It's fine to have these different orientations towards Jewish ecological work. However, I felt like that sometimes the political work around it felt like it would drown out the more cultural work. So that was one of the challenges for me. It was a challenge to be able to articulate how my work was really different than the work of other people whose work was more political than my work. Because it's much easier to articulate the political part. I think it feels like more extroverted, and my work always felt more introverted and more like really textual, really plumbing the text and trying to understand this as part of our culture that's for everybody and not just a particular political persuasion. So that had been a challenge for me. And another piece of this is that my identity, so some of these things, I would, when you live inside yourself, you don't see how, maybe you're different from other people. But I came to realize much later that my identity was very textual. It was really connected to reading the Bible. That's what I had been doing. That's what gave me incredible pleasure. And that's how I came into Judaism. And I was interested in texts. I was interested in the pleasure that studying gave me. I was interested in language. All of those things were part of what it means, for me to be Jewish. And then much more recently, but it kind of goes along with the last challenge, right? So about 7 or 8 years ago, I started working in a college, and started seeing the way that young people were exploring identity was so opposite from where I was coming from around identity as being part of my own spiritual formation as a human. And for them, their identity, they were starting to get interested. Some of them were just starting to get interested in Judaism. And the identity it felt like they weren't necessarily interested in texts at all. I mean, that was like the furthest thing from their mind. And the identity was all about political identity relative to Israel. I mean, that was a huge piece. Or relative to other political identities. And
so I just want to pause here for a second, because this is really important. I think it's quite common for adolescents and young adults to develop a sense of who they are in a fairly binary way. I am like these people and I'm not like these people. I am for this and I'm against this. This is right and this is wrong. And by hanging out with the people who agree with me about what's right and what's wrong, that's the building blocks of my identity. It sounds like, though, when you were growing up, you had a different approach to developing identity. You just referred to identity formation, and that makes it sound much more like an ongoing process, something that is rooted in a practice, reading and interpreting texts, as opposed to a fixed set of political positions or religious ideas or practices. Am I understanding that right, or did I just oversimplify things?
Totally right. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's one's identity is really the trajectory of one's life around finding meaning, I guess, kind of the search for meaning. And it's, yeah.
So you said identity is a trajectory, which is a noun, but really it's a verb that's masquerading as a noun to make itself feel more institutional.
Yeah.
So you would say, if we want,
it's a process and it keeps changing, right? And I feel like that's the thing, that our identity is changing all the time. It's really fascinating to me. So I just want to say a little bit as to where I am now. So I got really interested in Judaism and I threw myself into it when I founded Shomer Adamah. So I was in my 30s at that point. And my life was, I went to shul regularly. I was very involved in Jewish community in Philadelphia. I actually worked at the Jewish Federation for a little while. So my world was very defined by living in the Jewish world. And it's much less so now. So, and actually, and I don't know how to explain how everything happened, but I feel like my identity is even more universal now than it was. It was kind of like the bookends, right? It's very universal as a young person and very universal now. And when, like, for 20, 30 years in there, I was very, very involved in Jewish community, and that defined my life. Um, and as you know, I left Philadelphia, and that might have something to do with my change in identity now. And I also got married to someone who's not, who's Jewish, but doesn't have any, any relationship to Judaism. So all of that affects one's identity. I hear from all of these friends of mine who are in similar positions to me, like in, professional Jews in their 40s and 50s and 60s, and then their kids married people that weren't Jewish, whatever, and they don't have Jewish families anymore.
Mm.
And it changes everything. It really, so much of, I feel like, who we are has to do with who we're in relationship to.
So I just want to pause here because the word identity, you were talking about how different the college students you were working with were thinking about it. The word identity is usually thought of as pointing us towards some anchoring static thing that's independent of stuff like what our families are doing, what we're doing. Actually, in traditional communities, all of those things tend to align so much that it's not particularly meaningful to distinguish between what you are deep inside and what the culture around you is. It's more integrated than that. But in American society, identity usually is a way of referring to some aspect of us that is independent to some extent or persistent. And it's striking to particularly Jews very anxious about identity and the possibility that Jewish identity might be exactly what you said. It might be fluid, it might be circumstantial, it might change over the course of our lives. That tends to make a lot of American Jews very uncomfortable. So it's really striking that you are embracing that idea. And in a way, it sounds like saying identity is more about how we are living than about some essence inside us, what we're doing with our lives and what we're, the questions we're asking and the ways we're exploring them rather than this kind of fixed thing. So we should count on that to keep changing.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. I'm wondering if you would ask me another question. And I don't know if you want to go to that at this point, and you tell me, because I'm happy to go back to any questions that you have. But you had asked about sort of contemporary times, how I don't know, what was your question? Let's see. How my concept of identity informs my idea of what it means to be Jewish today. So, do you want to go to that yet?
I would love you to talk about that, but I also want to make sure that we leave enough time to do a little text study because you have offered a very tempting idea of looking at Torah from a perspective that I've never really engaged in deeply. So I'm hoping that we'll get that. So why don't you, yes, please do talk about that question, and then I would love it if we could look at a
Sure.
little text together.
I'll just, when you're in rabbinical school, or at least when I was in rabbinical school, we had, classes about what does it mean, like how different philosophers identified what it means to be Jewish. So, and I realized that I have very different ideas than a lot of these Jewish philosophers. So I'm just going to tell you some of the things that what it means to me to be Jewish. So one is to take Shabbat seriously, whatever that means. It doesn't mean going to shul necessarily. It's just about taking Shabbat seriously as a stoppage.
Mm.
Taking the holidays seriously, same thing. It doesn't have to mean going to shul, but just knowing that these holidays are happening and being celebrating, honoring them, acknowledging them in some way, that so that they infuse your life. For me, having some thoughts about what God might mean. And by that, I just mean that there's something bigger than us. It's, it's not just all about humans, that there's some force that's larger than us. Having a relationship with creation feels like a critical part of being Jewish to me. Participating in tikkun in some way, participating in community, honoring kashrut by bringing some attention to what we purchase, that it fits in to the way that a meaningful universe that's sustainable and healthy. Some relationship to Hebrew, and some relationship to our ancestors. And for me, that's like biblical ancestry, and for me, Abraham has always been a key ancestor in terms of taking risks, leaving what he had, leaving behind everything that he knew and just taking off. So I just wanted to say that.
That's a pretty great list. It seems like if everybody who feels like they need to redefine Judaism and Jewishness for themselves could use that list, and they would fill in those elements in very different ways, but still be able to feel anchored at a lot of the key points that would still be guaranteed to have a lot in common with Jewish communities around the world and across time.
Thank you. Yeah, it was fun to do. All right, shall I do the share screen now? Okay. Whoops, hang on one second. Let's see. All right, so. Okay, can you see this?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So, okay, so what I have here is, so basically what I wanted to share was how central the earth is in our tradition and how overlooked it is. And so one of the things that I've spent time on in the last 15 years is really just looking at the place, just from a language perspective, of the word land, which is Adamah in Hebrew, and also the word Eretz, both words for land or earth in Hebrew. And I've talked about this a lot when I was writing my Passover Haggadah. One of the things that I realized was that the word Eretz occurs over 2,000 times in Tanakh. And that blew my mind, just realizing that, in fact, how deeply a part of biblical tradition the land or the earth is, but we just so overlook it. So what I did here was I just took I'm just looking here at the Adam and Eve story, Genesis 2 and 2 through 3. And I just took all the verses that had the word Adamah in it, and I put them together. And it's like you can tell a whole story just from these verses. One of the things I wanted to point out is that part of the reason that we don't see the land or the earth in our texts is because if you're reading in English, they are not consistently translated. So you don't hear the words repeated over and over again. So Joy, as a poet, I'm sure, I would imagine that one of the things that's exciting for you is the repetition of words in Hebrew, like that these, in English, you don't want to be repeating all the time, right? But in Hebrew, that repetition is poetry. like hearing the same words coming up over and over. So I just wanted to read, we can do the Adam and Eve story if we have time. We can also do Cain and Abel. So
I just ask you
yeah.
quickly, what's the difference between the word for earth and the word for land and the word for dust? Are those all distinct words in Hebrew?
So earth and land are somewhat interchangeable. So the thing is more about if you're into the various author theory of the Bible. Anyway, regardless of that, Adamah occurs mostly in the early texts in Genesis. So, and it can mean both earth and land. But it mostly means tillable land, tillable soil. And Eretz most people think of it in terms of the country, land as country, but it also can mean land as earth, as habitat, as the whole earth. So there's a lot of space and interchangeability of these two words, and I think it just has more to do with who's using it. But you do see sometimes in poetry, like you'll see one line of poetry, and the first line will refer to Eretz, and the second line will refer to Adamah. So you're getting the sense that they hold the same valence, or I don't know.
Right, there's parallelism.
Yeah.
And so in biblical parallelism, partly it's a way of using synonyms, presenting things as synonyms, but also implying that there are small differences, like saying, focus on these things and think about if they're exactly the same in this way, or if there's some kind of subtle difference. It's sort of a poetic trick to imply meaning without having to specify it and leave it to readers to do.
Yeah, so I just thought we should read this out loud. And okay.
Yeah.
All right. And also I just want to show people that what I did is I highlighted in red the word land, which in the Hebrew is Adamah here. And I showed JPS stands for Jewish Publication Society. A lot of folks that go to synagogue are reading the JPS translation of this text. And so I showed other translations that they used rather than land. And so in one case they use earth, in a couple of cases they use ground, and in another case they use soil. Okay, but I'm saying that if you continually use land, you start seeing the land starts coming alive. Okay, so no bush of the field was yet on earth, no plant of the field had yet sprung, for Yud-He-Vav-He God had not made it rain upon earth. And there was no human to till the land. But a surge would well up from the earth and water all the face of the land. And Yud-He-Vav-He God formed the human of the dust from the land. He blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the human became a living being. Yud-He-Vav-He God caused to spring up from the land every type of tree desirable to look at and good to eat, and the tree of life in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowing of good and evil. So Yud-He-Vav-He God formed from the land every living thing of the field and every fowl of the heavens, and brought each to the human to see what he would call it. And whatever the human called it as a living being, that became its name. To Adam he said, because you have hearkened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, you are not to eat from it, the land is cursed because of you. In pain, toil, you shall eat from it every day of your life. By the sweat of your brow will you eat bread until you return to the land, for from it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, God sent him away from the Garden of Eden to work the land from which he had been taken.
So it's really great to look at it this way. And in Hebrew, we would be struck by the fact that the word Adamah and the word Adam are related to one another. So every time you hear Adam, you also have to think of Adamah. You can't
Right.
actually think about the human without thinking about the land. And this makes me suspect that I know why you felt such an intuitive connection when you started looking at these texts, because you said when you were a child you would escape your family. The anthropocentric, just the human world, didn't actually make you feel connected and at home. But when you were in the world of Adamah that's being referred to here, you did feel connected. So you were really like the prototypical Adam who is directly umbilically related to the Adamah that you were taken from. And I'm guessing that when you hear about, uh, you know, when you're dead, you return to the Adamah, for you, that's like not an unhappy ending, I would guess.
That's right. Right. Yeah. But yeah, I want to just point out to folks that what you just said is right here in Genesis 2:5, right? There was no human Adam to till the land, the Adamah. And also just to point out that Adamah is feminine with a hey ending there. And so to me, this is the whole story. This is like a prelude or a foreshadowing of everything that's going to happen in the rest of Torah. You know, it's like everything was all connected to begin with. Then we, you know, and we're all connected. It's not just us that's made of the land. All the trees are made, you know, are brought up from the earth, and all the animals are brought up from the earth. And then the minute we go and do something that's kind of, for me, the way I understand it is like against the natural law. We take something that doesn't belong to us. And then the land is cursed because of us. To me, that's so powerful that our behaviors end up affecting the earth. What we do is, the first pollution comes from us.
This is an environmental impact statement.
Right. Right. And that's that we cause the contamination. Just, you know, in our actions by what we do.
So Ellen, can I just ask about the action? So the way that we're not looking at the transgression of the law, that they're being punished from their two trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Being human, instead of going right for the tree of life, which there's no prohibition on, we could eat from the tree of life, live forever, that would be fine with God. No, we're like, let's do the thing we're not supposed to do. Take the fruit that is we're not supposed to eat. And many people, because of the name of that tree and that fruit and the way that story is told, the consequences, their eyes were open, they see that they're naked, that's a further level of estrangement from the natural world, right? Before they eat the fruit, they don't say to themselves, oh, I'm human, I should be wearing clothes. If I'm not, I'm naked, there's something wrong, I feel exposed. Afterward, they feel that. So many people see this as being about the birth of distinctly human consciousness, an evolutionary sense, you might say. We're going from pre-human anthropoids, hominids, to the folks who have burial rituals and language and symbolic stuff. But I'm wondering if you're seeing it in a different kind of way. That action that causes, that brings the contamination, that brings the curse to the land.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing it as the first real, that it's a real transgression that is that speaks to the human condition, that this is, that this is the kind of thing that we do, and that all of these kinds of thoughtless actions
Mhm.
and actions kind of without gratitude or without attention to the value of the natural world. I mean, this
Mhm.
is God's world. And it's like these thoughtless actions then in turn cause a cursing of the earth, of the land. Um, so
So,
I'm really reading
yeah.
very much what's right there on the surface, just really looking at the language, and it gets even more powerful in the next.
Mm. Mm.
I don't know that that you want to look at that or not,
I
but
mean, oh, yeah, we have like another minute or two. Just give us a quick tour, and I promise not to interrupt and slow things down.
okay. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but with Cain and Abel. But again, we find the land coming up over and over again, and we have in first of all, we have, like, if you start looking at verse 10, 4:10. So he said, what have you done? A sound, your brother's blood cries out to me from the land. So again, you have the sense of the land being alive or generative in some way, and that's the primary thing that's so important, is understanding this generative nature of the earth, that it's not just dead, flat, inert, nothing. It's something, it's real, it's alive. And now you will be cursed from the land, which opened up its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. And it continues. And then the plum in verse 14, which to me is always been incredibly powerful. Here you drive me away today from the face of the land, and from your face must I conceal myself. So there's an equivalence between the face of the land and God's face here. And it just seems so powerful to me that this, the sense of the sacred is pervasive through the land, throughout the Torah. And as I said, that, for me, every time now when I hear the language of land or earth, it's like this resonance, like hypertext. One time it appears, it relates to every other time that it appears. And yeah.
Yeah. Which is just what Robert Alter says about the repetition of words in the very small Hebrew vocabulary. He says that the words accumulate meaning because each one echoes you back to the previous. So it accrues meaning. So you're pointing out some of the meanings that are accrued just in the opening chapters here. Thanks to you, I now notice, yeah, Cain he's the worker of the land. And he comes up with the idea of, oh, I should bring some of my produce to God. That's a way of, I'm going to take the work of the land and what it produces, and I'm going to use that to express my relationship to God. That's a normal thing for him. It goes wrong because of sibling rivalry. And I had not seen before that the curse, that he interprets the curse that he's given as both alienating him from the land, and this is not what God says, alienating him from God. And that face, that idea that the land, like God, sees us, it looks at us, it's aware of us, it's not only affected by us, but we take on identity in relation to the land. And he's like, oh my God, I have two sources of being seen. I'm leaving my family. I have two ways of being seen. One is you in your face, the other is the face of the land, and now I'm cut off from both of them, and I can't bear that degree of alienation.
Mhm.
And you're pointing out that the model of the human right from the very beginning, the creation of a human called Adamah, is one of, yeah, human beings are distinct and have different relations and things like that. But contrary to where you started with in the environmental movement, where this very reductive, exploitative idea that religion passes on of the human relation to the earth, you're saying, no, it's reciprocal right from the beginning. Right from the beginning, human beings are reminded We come from the earth. What we do affects the earth. We have to accept limits on what we take. It's not true that if you know there's oil there, you should just take it. That's like, oh, well, we know there's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Let's harvest. That both for the sake of the land and for the sake of our Pnei Adamah, our being in the face of God, both of those are affected by the acceptance of limits and the recognition that we human beings never act without consequence to
Right.
the land that we are a part of.
Beautiful. That's
No,
exactly.
thank you.
Yes. Yeah. And as I said, I feel like all of these introductory stories, these Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, for me, they just feel like they are foreshadowing of everything else. Everything is, I love what you just said about Robert Alter. Everything else is building on this. And it's just it's so critical. And I feel that so many people overlook these stories because they're so familiar or they're considered myth, you know, and, but I think it's really rich. So.
Well, I can now see what you were saying. At first, it was hard for me to understand when you were saying that your idea of identity is rooted in text study, because this text study really challenges me to a different understanding of my identity as a human being and as a creature. You know, looking at these words and seeing how they're connected to one another really changes the way I understand myself in a way that is universal, even though it's elaborated in very particular ways through Hebrew in the Torah and the relationship of Jews to a particular land. Ellen, thank you so much. This is a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
And I hope that you and everybody is going into a rich and meaningful Shavuot festival. And this gives us some new ways to receive, it gives me some new ways to receive Torah. I'm definitely going to be keeping my ear out for the word Adamah and land. And I want to invite everybody back next week when I'll be talking to Rabbi Lauren Tuchman, who will have a conversation called "The Soul You Placed Into Me is Pure, Spiritual Leadership, Spiritual Practice, and the Importance of Inner Truth." I think there's going to be a lot of resonance with the conversation that Ellen and I just had. I think Lauren has also had to forge her own understanding of what it means to be a rabbi and a spiritual leader and to make something transformative and meaningful out of the model of Judaism that she inherited. So I hope everybody will come back for that and stay well and safe. Ellen, thank you.
Thank you.